Hello, my name is Adam Montgomery. I'm a historian based in the Niagara region who loves visiting, photographing, and documenting old cemeteries. Welcome to the first of a series of videos about historic Drummond Hill Cemetery in Niagara Falls. As a cemetery which saw its first burial in 1799 and was later the site of the Battle of Lundy's Lane during the War of 1812, these grounds are brimming with history and stories. Although perhaps best known as the burial site of War of 1812 hero Laura Secord, there are many other reasons to visit. With over 2,500 gravestones still extant, some dating back to the early 1800s, Drummond Hill is a great cemetery for teaching us about a range of topics. You could literally spend days here and still come across something new each visit. Today's video is the first of a two-part series about some of the most common symbols you'll find on stones at Drummond Hill and what they mean. The first time you walk into an old cemetery, these symbols can seem mysterious and daunting. In some cases, we're not even sure what we're looking at. But once you learn to recognize a symbol, before you know it, you'll be walking the grounds with the eyes of someone from the 19th century and feel like you've learned a new language and vocabulary. On that note, let's get started. One of the most common symbols you'll find at Drummond Hill and other Victorian-era cemeteries is the hand with a finger pointing upward. This symbol is relatively common on stones dating from roughly the 1850 to 1880 period, and examples can be seen even into the early 20th century. When we think of the importance and influence of Christianity during this era, the meaning becomes somewhat obvious. The hand is that of the deceased pointing toward heaven, expressing confidence that they view bodily death as only the beginning. The hand usually appears framed on its own, though if you are lucky enough to spot a stone which has stood the test of time well, you can sometimes find words above it that confirm this interpretation, such as gone home, gone before, or even longer sentences such as there is rest in heaven. The pointing hand can also sometimes help with historical detective work. When you find a small gravestone with a miniature hand pointing upward, even if the inscription has faded so much it's illegible, the small hand is usually an indicator the deceased was a child. If found beside gravestones for a husband and wife, you can sometimes use this clue to surmise that it was their child. Although this symbol is somewhat common, it's always worth looking closely at for details that can also appear around it. Another intriguing symbol is that of the dove. Doves are mentioned numerous times in the Bible, but perhaps the most important one for our purposes is in Genesis when, during the Great Flood, Noah released a dove from the ark for the second time and it came back with a freshly picked olive leaf, indicating the waters had receded and God had made peace with humanity. For this reason, you'll occasionally see a dove flying with an olive leaf in its beak, symbolizing peace. Doves are also mentioned numerous times in the New Testament where it is associated with the Holy Spirit. For example, Matthew chapter 3 verse 16, the story of Jesus' baptism, says after Jesus came up from the water, quote, "The heavens were opened and he saw the Spirit of God descending as a dove and lighting on him." Lastly, doves also symbolize innocence, as seen for example when in Matthew chapter 10 verse 16, Jesus says to the 12 apostles, quote, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves." Doves appear on both adults and children's stones and can be seen flying sideways, flying downward symbolizing peace and sometimes an untimely death, or flying upward, often symbolizing the soul going to heaven. As you can see from these examples in marble, because they were often carved in 3 dimensions, many have unfortunately tended to weather and erode, making them difficult to make out at first glance. But once you get used to seeing them and the details, you'll spot many and enjoy identifying the slightly different way each monument maker added their own touches. Continuing the animal theme, here we can see an example of a lamb. Lambs are somewhat common in 19th century cemeteries and are associated with innocence and the Lamb of God, that is, Jesus. They can appear on gravestones for adults, but sadly, in the vast majority of cases, they signify the death of an infant or young child. Because lambs symbolize innocence, they fit well with Victorian and Romantic notions of children being pure and innocent, that is, without sin. In the example shown here, you see the lamb sitting down, but as shown in the next example, the lamb can sometimes be seen laying down, in this case on a bed of flowers. Although lambs are often sad to see, since they usually signify the death of a child, if we put ourselves in the minds of 19th century people, there was also an element of comfort here. Since children were viewed as pure and innocent, they were seen as being assured a place in heaven. I'm sure many of us can recall hearing or reading references at some point in our life to Matthew chapter 19 verse 14 when Jesus said, quote, "Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Since lambs were so often put on the gravestones of children, they can be used for finding clues to where a young child was buried from a particular family. As a brief aside, lambs are symbols of innocence in Jewish cemeteries as well, where they also indicate the death of a child, though in the case of Jewish gravestones, the lamb is not associated with Jesus. Moving away from the animal theme now, one of the most common symbols at Drummond Hill Cemetery, and in many 19th century cemeteries, is the urn. Seeing urns can be very confusing to those first exploring old cemeteries, and sometimes leads to misconceptions about death in the 19th century. People might see urns and imagine that, like many in the 21st century, Victorian-era Canadians chose cremation as a way of disposing of theirs or others' remains. In fact, cremation in Canadian settler society did not begin until the early 1900s, and then very slowly. Urns are present in such high numbers because of the classical revival that influenced Europe and North America. In Canada, this trend was particularly marked in the 19th century. Architects, and following them monument makers, became enamored with classical modes of expression, including how ancient Greeks and Romans handled human remains. The urn in the 19th century cemetery, often designed in imitation of ancient ash containers, thus became, among other things, a symbol of bodily death. But like we discussed with the other common symbols, many Christians had a strong belief in the resurrection of the body. So when placed atop a monument, the urn often signified the body dying, but the soul ascending. This symbol fit in well with Christian beliefs that life on earth was to be seen as just the beginning. Urns become more interesting when we see that some of them have what looks like folded cloth covering part or all of them. This drapery has been interpreted a few ways, one of which is that it represents what was thought of as the veil between life and death. When taken with the urn symbolizing bodily death, the two together often symbolize the deceased entering behind the veil. These veils were also a nod to the tradition of holding a pall over the top of a coffin and head and shoulders of those called underbearers, who bore the coffin or device it was placed on to the grave. Now stepping away from urns, but continuing with the veil theme, we can see this symbol on gravestones in general. On this tall stone, we can see a veil draped over the top of the stone, covering a book. A book most often symbolizes the Bible, so here we can surmise that the symbolism might be something like, the deceased has entered into the veil in faith, once again pointing to mourning and the end of life, but also confidence in resurrection. You might have to squint a bit for this next one since this stone is very old, but I've pointed to it with arrows and labeled it so you can see. Here again we see curtains playing the same sort of role, symbolizing the end of life and entering behind the veil. Lastly, here we can faintly see an example from this very old stone where the curtains are framing a tombstone, here making the symbolism a little more obvious again. This sort of motif, with curtains framing a tombstone, is a little rarer, but quite powerful when you see it, since it reminds you that although we can view these stones as art and history, the scene is meant to represent the death of someone that was a real person. The next symbol is in many ways both a symbol and a motif. It's a tricky one to identify in some cases, but I've chosen to include it because it's ubiquitous and also has an incredibly long history. In case you haven't guessed yet, I'm talking about the acanthus leaf. Acanthus leaves, whether mostly flat as in this example, or carved in 3 dimensions on temple or church column capitals, began appearing as early as the 5th century BCE in ancient Greece. Later, they were very popular in ancient Roman architecture and have persisted ever since. You'll see many stylizations of acanthus leaves based on different traditions and inspirations, with some having rounded points and others looking quite prickly. In this first example, we see rounded points. In the next example, we find the one more commonly seen in old cemeteries, with sharper points and curling or folding throughout. In some cases, we can surmise that when used as decoration rather than the central motif, acanthus leaves were added simply because they looked appealing and had associations with classical art. That being said, when used as the central symbol or motif, as in Christian art sometimes throughout the centuries, the acanthus leaves sometimes represented paradise, since they were believed to grow there. Others have interpreted the prickly leaves as symbolizing the difficult journey of life, viewed by many 19th century Christians as fraught with troubles and sin. As with many cemetery symbols, there's no perfect interpretation that works in every case, but this doesn't take away from the fun you can have spotting it on gravestones and buildings in many beautiful styles. What makes acanthus leaves even more rewarding to identify is that they can still be seen on everything from decorative picture frames to fancy chairs. Walk into a large art gallery with old artwork, and in many cases you'll find at least a few frames with acanthus leaf borders. Trust me when I say that once you begin to recognize it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. No discussion of 19th century symbols at Drummond Hill, or many other old cemeteries for that matter, would be complete without talking about one of the most common symbols, the weeping willow. This is a symbol that really requires little explanation, since even to those who are entirely unfamiliar with walking old cemeteries, the name and associations in Western culture are familiar ones. Victorians, who really perfected, for lack of a better word, mourning culture, loved the willow because its hanging branches seemed to express the idea of sorrow. References to willows and its associations with gloom, death, and mourning can be found in 19th century literature, and it also appeared in other mediums such as mourning jewelry. But the history goes back even further, and it was associated with melancholy even in Shakespeare's Othello, when Desdemona sings the Willow song, a song that originated in 1583 or possibly earlier. The day I took these next photos, the stones were a bit dirty, but you see here another 2 examples that show just how different the stylizations could be. If you walk old cemeteries as a hobby or for leisure strolls, it becomes tempting after a while to ignore the weeping willows, since you'll see quite a few. But I encourage you to fight against that thought. Because there were so many willows in cemeteries, something 19th century monument makers no doubt recognized, each designer added their own touches, and some of these can be viewed as works of art, worthy of display in a gallery or museum. That concludes part 1 of this 2-part series on symbols at Drummond Hill Cemetery. I hope you've enjoyed learning about some of the meanings these symbols had to the people who created and viewed them. I also hope this video will inspire you to visit Drummond Hill and learn more about its history and the many people who are buried there. If you're interested in more of my activities, I run both a Twitter and Instagram account where I post examples of gravestones, stories, and other topics related to cemetery history. You'll be able to find the handles at the end of this video. Needless to say, Drummond Hill stones often make an appearance there. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join us for part 2, coming soon.